Alright, so I have a question for you guys to get started today. How often do you use the metronome when you practice? If you're like me, we can often be guilty of practicing without the metronome. Maybe we can use play-alongs sometimes, or maybe we're just used to playing with a band, where people kind of follow our time, our sense of time, and we feel it as a group. But really the best way to work on your sense of tempo and sense of time feel is in the practice room with a metronome. So I'm here today to talk to y'all about how to make friends with the metronome. As we know, the metronome doesn't lie, and sometimes it can be your best friend or worst enemy. And we all have been, in that place where we're practicing a piece, maybe that we're having trouble with, maybe a difficult passage, and it seems like that metronome is just fighting us every step of the way. So what I'm going to show you today are some ideas for tips that you can use to practice the metronome to get a consistent sense of time feel. Working from the ground up, starting at a comfortable tempo and bumping up the tempo to where you feel that you can play at a variety of tempos and still stay with the metronome. And I've also got some creative ways that you can use the metronome to enhance your internal sense of time. So that you have more independence and a stronger general sense of time feel, so that when you go to play in a group, you can equally contribute to the time feel and not feel like you have to rely on someone else's sense of time. So the metronome can be a great way to work on that. So we're going to start with just a typical warm-up, just your basic scales using the metronome. And we're going to start more traditionally, maybe how you're used to using the metronome. I'm going to start with mine on 102 beats per minute. And I'm just going to try some eighth note scales, just like you would in your regular warm-up routine. So this is on every quarter note, right? And we're going to play eighth notes. So if we do C major, pretty simple, right? So that must be familiar for a lot of people. That's kind of a more classical approach to practicing scales, right? Of course, we can always change things up when we're practicing jazz and add some swung eighth notes. So the metronome's sort of acting as our drummer here, right? Well, what would happen if we changed this up and only had our drummer playing on beats 1 and 3? So we got to do a little math here. If we were at 102, now we're going to divide that by 2. We're going to change our metronome to 51. So that's half as fast. This is now going to be the half note. If you have a fancy metronome app, you can often change the subdivision. For example, my metronome has a functionality where I can remove some beats, which can be a fun way to change this up. If you have an old-fashioned analog thing, you can just have the tempo just like we did. But if you want to get fancy, you can remove every other beat. So this would be the half note now. So I'm going to go old-fashioned for now and just have mine on 51, half as fast. So now we are at 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So already you can tell it's more important for me to maintain that time feel without the aid of the metronome on all 4 beats. We had the metronome on 1 and 3. We can also flip that around and have the metronome on 2 and 4. So if it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's a little bit of a different feel. Rather than having the metronome on the strong beats, we've got it on every other beat of the measure. You call it the weak beats. So that's an interesting challenge to try. Now we can go one step further, and rather than having it on beats 1 and 3, we can just have it on one beat in the measure. So that would be beat 1 to start, and we're going to use 26. If we were doing some math, it'd be like 26.5, but my metronome doesn't go in between the numbers. I only have whole numbers, so I'm going to use 27. Let's try that. This is going to be the whole note now. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so you'll notice that we were playing the same tempo pretty much the whole time, right? Maybe by a difference of a few decimals, but not a noticeable difference. The tempo was consistent throughout, but the number of beats the metronome was giving us went from 4 beats, every beat in the measure, to half the number of beats, each half note, versus a whole note, 1 beat per measure. The whole note can be very challenging because there's so much space in between each beat that it's giving us. You want to make sure that you're landing on the same beat as the metronome at the beginning of each measure, which can be challenging. One way to get around this, to improve your sense of time, is to feel the small beats. So if the metronome is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, you can even just practice saying the 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it can be easy to get a little ahead if you're feeling it a little faster than the metronome, or a little behind. So the metronome, like we said, it never lies. So we want to get used to feeling that tempo with the metronome to improve our internal sense of time. Now that the metronome isn't feeding us all 4 beats, we got to get used to that. If you wanted to take this exercise a step further, you could place the beat on a different part of the measure. You could place it on beat 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so we can see that really reveals any sort of imperfections. If we're rushing in a spot or dragging, we'll soon notice that we're either ahead or behind that beat. So our internal sense of time has to match where the metronome is placing the beat. So we just did this exercise with a major scale. You can do this with straight or swung eighth notes. You can do your normal scale routine like 4 octaves, contrary motion, 2 octaves, intervals at the 10th or the 6th, anything you have in your technical practice or warm-up routine. You can do this with the metronome. You can also practice chords in this way. You can practice some comping. Like, for example, if we go back up to our half note at 51 beats per minute, I can practice some 2 5s. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is sort of an in-between tempo. This is a little slower than maybe we're used to comping at, but it can be good to also test yourself at different tempos. We were at 102 to the quarter note. You can go up to 108, 116, 120, and feel what it's like to comp at all those different tempos without having the aid of the metronome on all 4 beats. So you can practice this for scales, comping. The most important thing, I think, to use this for is improvising, because we want to have a good eighth note flow whenever we're improvising. So what I'll do is I'll play a blues, for example, and practice it with the metronome on 1 and 3, just to see what that would feel like. So we're going to speed it up to 144 for this blues. If we divide that by 2, that's going to be 72. So our half note is 72 beats per minute, and our quarter note is 144. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Right, so that was a little bit of Billy's bounce at this new tempo, 72 to the half note. And I put the metronome on beats 1 and 3. So I'm not relying on all 4 beats to tell me where the tempo is. And when I do my improvised eighth note lines, I really have to settle into that time feel. We can do the same thing on 2 and 4 just to change it up. 1, 2, 1, 2. So that's what it would sound like on 2 and 4. Now lastly, we're going to go all the way down, divide that by 2, that would be 36, and we're going to make it the whole note now. So let's try it on beat 1. This is a little more challenging, so I'm going to do just the right hand just to focus on that. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So that was a chorus of blues with the metronome on only beat 1. Now just like we talked about earlier, you can move this to beat 2, which can be really challenging when you're not playing a set melody or chords in your left hand if you're just improvising with your right hand. This is something that bass players will do a lot when they're practicing walking. They'll say, I'm walking all 4 beats, but am I lining up with the metronome when it's on beat 2 only? Or if it's on beat 4 only? You could even go a little further and divide it in half again and put it on beat 1 of every other measure, which would be a really long space. So that's a fun exercise you can use to test your internal sense of time or your internal metronome when you're practicing improvising. So I hope this gives you some helpful ideas of ways that you can make friends with the metronome and improve your internal sense of time. I would start with scales, both straight eighths and swung, then do some chord changes, some comping with your favorite voicings, and then try some improvising and see how it goes. All right, happy practicing, everybody.